This is the Athlete Within podcast. I'm Kate Allgood. This podcast is about understanding what actually happens internally when you compete, especially when the pressure rises. Because performance isn't just about what you're capable of, it's about what you can access when it matters. And over time, learning how to stay steady under pressure so you can play freely. There's a point for a lot of athletes where sport stops feeling simple. Not in the sense that it becomes physically harder, but in the way it starts to feel internally. What used to feel like something you did, something you moved through, something you responded within, starts to feel like something you're carrying. There's more weight to it, more significance, more attached to each moment than there used to be. And for many athletes, this doesn't happen all at once. It builds over time. As you improve, as expectations increase, as the level gets higher, as more becomes possible, as more is on the line. What used to feel like playing starts to feel like performing, and what used to feel like performing starts to feel like needing to perform a certain way. And that shift changes the experience. Because now, it's not just about what's happening in front of you, it's about what it means. What it means if you play well, what it means if you don't, what it means about where you're at, what it means about where you're going, what it might mean to other people, what it might mean to you. And when that meaning starts to build, something else starts to build alongside it. Pressure. Not just external pressure, not just the game or the opponent or the situation, but internal pressure. The kind that comes from within, the kind that isn't always visible, but is constantly present in the way you think, the way you feel, and the way you approach the moment. And what's difficult about this is that most athletes don't recognize it as something separate from their standards. It all blends together. It feels like part of being driven, part of caring, part of wanting to improve and perform at a high level. Which is why it often goes unquestioned, because from the outside, and even from within, it looks like commitment. But internally, it feels different. Internal pressure tends to carry urgency. There's a sense that something needs to happen, that something needs to go a certain way, that this moment matters more than others. There's often a tightening that comes with it, a feeling that you need to be sharp, precise, on, not just engaged, but exact. And with that comes a constant evaluation. Am I doing this right? Is this good enough? Am I where I'm supposed to be? Am I playing the way I should be playing? It becomes difficult to just be in the moment because part of your attention is always slightly ahead or slightly outside of what's happening, measuring, anticipating, comparing. And over time, that creates a very different internal environment to perform within. Because instead of moving through the moment, you're trying to manage the moment. Instead of responding, you're controlling. Instead of allowing performance to unfold, you're trying to guide it into a certain outcome. And that's where things start to feel heavy. What makes this even more complex is that internal pressure often comes from a good place. It comes from wanting to do well, wanting to improve, wanting to make the most of opportunities, wanting to meet the level you know you're capable of. There's nothing wrong with those things. In fact, they're often what drive athletes forward. But when that desire turns into pressure, it changes how you show up. Because now there's something at stake in every moment. And when something feels like it's at stake, your system responds. You become more aware, more alert, more focused on what could go wrong, more sensitive to mistakes, more reactive to anything that feels off. And that's where it starts to connect back to what we've talked about in the first couple episodes. Because more internal pressure leads to more activation. More activation leads to changes in attention, and those changes affect how you perform. Not because you care too much, but because how that care is showing up is changing the conditions you're performing within. And this is where the distinction between internal pressure and standards becomes really important. Because standards are different. Standards don't carry the same urgency. They don't fluctuate moment to moment based on how things are going. They're stable. They're clear. They guide how you prepare, how you train, how you approach your sport over time. They reflect the level you're working toward, the way you want to show up consistently. but they don't demand that every single moment meets that level. There's space within standards. There's consistency, but there's also flexibility. You can have high standards and still move through a moment where things aren't perfect without feeling like something is wrong. Internal pressure doesn't allow for that space. It tightens around the moment. It demands that things go a certain way. It reacts quickly when they don't. And because of that, it creates a constant sense of needing to correct, adjust, or fix what's happening. And that's where athletes often get stuck, because they believe the pressure is helping them stay sharp, helping them stay focused, helping them perform at the level they expect from themselves. But in reality, it's often doing the opposite. It's creating tension where there needs to be responsiveness. It's creating urgency where there needs to be timing. It's creating control where there needs to be flow. And over time, it becomes exhausting. Not always in a way that's obvious, but in a way that shows up in how heavy things start to feel, how difficult it becomes to just play, how much energy gets spent managing thoughts, managing feelings, managing performance. And that's when athletes start to question themselves again. Why does this feel so hard? Why can't I just play the way I know I can? Why does everything feel like it matters so much? And the answer isn't that you need to care less. It's that the way you're caring has shifted from something that supports your performance to something that's starting to interfere with it. And that's an important distinction, because the solution isn't to remove standards. It's not to lower expectations. It's to detach from what you're working toward. It's to change your relationship with those things, to allow your standards to guide you without turning them into pressure in every moment. Because one of the most useful things an athlete can start to notice is not just what they're doing, but how they're relating to the moment they're in. There's a difference between stepping into a moment with a clear standard of how you want to show up and stepping into it with a sense that something has to go a certain way. And that difference often shows up in the tone of your thinking. When it's coming from pressure, there's usually urgency, a sense that you need to get this right, that you can't afford a mistake, that this moment matters more than the others. It feels tight, and it tends to pull your attention slightly away from what's actually happening. When it's coming from standards, it feels different. It's still focused, still intentional, but there's more space. You're engaging in what you're doing, not trying to force it into a certain outcome. And in that moment, that's something you can begin to notice. Not to fix it immediately, not to try to remove it completely, but just to recognize it. Because once you can recognize that shift, you don't have to follow it in the same way. You don't have to tighten with it, or speed up with it, or try to control everything within it. You can let that urgency settle just enough and bring your attention back to something simple and in front of you. The next play, the next movement, the next decision. Not perfectly, just enough to stay connected. And over time, that changes the experience, because you're no longer adding pressure on top of what's already there. You're allowing yourself to stay within the moment without turning it into something it doesn't need to be. Because athletes who perform most consistently aren't the ones who feel the least pressure. They're the ones who aren't adding to it unnecessarily. They're able to hold their standards without turning every moment into something that has to go a certain way. They're able to stay connected to what's in front of them even when the moment carries weight. And that's something that can be developed. Not by trying to remove the importance of what you're doing, but by learning how to carry it differently. So that when you step into competition, you're not carrying something that's working against you. You're carrying something that supports how you show up. And that shift doesn't always feel dramatic, but it changes the experience in a way that makes performance feel lighter, more responsive, and more available again. And that's what we'll keep building from here. If something in this episode resonated with you, or helped you better understand your own experience in competition, then that awareness matters. Because the more clearly you understand what's happening internally under pressure, the more intentionally you can begin to work with it. And that's what we'll keep building on throughout this season. This is The Athlete Within.